Hello and welcome to today's session where we're going to talk about power and conflict poetry. We're going to break the session up into a couple of little sections. First of all, we're going to just look at an overview of what to do when you're revising power and conflict poetry, kind of questions you might see, what you need to know about the poems and how much detail. Then we're going to look at three poems. We're going to look at Ozymandias, we're going to look at London, and we are going to look at extract from the Prelude as well. And we're just going to have a little brief 10-minute overview of each of them and get you some notes on those poems as well. So obviously you need your anthologies, and I know some of you will go out and buy lots and lots of revision guides and things like that as well. So some of you might have, we've got one called The Art of Poetry here, which is pretty useful with loads of detailed notes about the poems. I know lots of people buy the Cgp Revision Guide as well, which I used for my own GCSE and I found really useful, and you can see there are loads of annotations on every poem there as well. And I think it's important that you get something to kind of help you with these poems, because what we find is that lots of people have different annotations. Just a couple of things to be aware. First of all, when it comes to any kind of revision material you're using for poetry, just remember this is one person's interpretation of this poem. And, you know, if I look at the CGP one, for instance, they give you lots of detailed notes. But that's not to say it's the only way you could interpret some of these quotations as well. Some of you need to explore them in a lot of detail, but you do get lots and lots of notes. So just be mindful that there's no right answer with poetry. It's about trying to find notes in detail. And we'll look at kind of what you need to know in a little bit of detail as well. If you remember, we were talking about the stages of revision that you need to cover for GCSE literature. And in terms of poetry, the events and key themes of each of the 15 power and conflict poems, you need to know what happens, beginning, middle and end, and the key themes of those poems. So you need to be able to explain to either yourself or somebody what happens in each of them. And you can do that by looking at the Cgp Revision Guides. These are really useful. They've got lovely little summaries. The book I had there, The Art of Poetry, you've got some nice kind of essays explaining what happens. You've got some lovely detailed essays on analysis there as well. Really, really useful stuff. You can watch Mr. Bruff videos. He's got some longer videos on each, about half an hour, going into detail. He's got some really short kind of 6-minute ones just drilling down into detail, and we've got some that we're kind of putting together. So that's how you can fill in those gaps of what happens. And what we're going to do from that is we're going to look at the next stage where we're looking to understand 6 to 7, 7 to 8 in depth, 2 to 3 war, 2 to 3 personal, 2 to 3 nature and kamikaze. It's quite a nice little one size fits all poem there. And can you explain key themes in those 6 to 7 and analyse 3 to 4 quotations and 2 to 3 examples of context or ideas in those poems? So we're starting to look at not what we know in every one, because we don't know which one's going to come up. And obviously, because we don't know which one's going to come up, we can't really say, well, you know, we're just going to revise 1 or 2. We need to know what happens in each and every one of them. But then we've got some, let's say 7 or 8 prepared in detail. So right, okay, let's say I got extract from the Prelude. I haven't revised that, but I can treat it almost as an unseen, and then I'll use my notes from another nature poem if that's what the question says there. So we've got a poetry grid. Some of you will have used this last year. This is available on Teams. It's available through the English department. We're going to do something slightly different in these sessions. We're going to get a few more detailed notes on these poems. So I'm conscious that with lockdown, it might be a case that people have got gaps in their notes there as well. And then obviously the next stage is to turn your essay into comparison essays in 45 minutes. And you've actually got, because you're writing about 2 poems, you've only really got time in the exam to talk about 2 or 3 quotations per poem as well. So that's our stages of revision. When you're looking at the poems then, the first thing to note is that when you're comparing the poems, you'll get a question that says, compare how poets present a theme. And we've got the 3 main themes here, which is war and conflict, man and humanity, and nature. You could have themes as broad as grief. You could have themes like identity, memory. It could be absolutely anything in that theme. But they will always give you one poem and the full text of that poem, and they'll give you a list of all the other poets and poems there. The idea is that if you want to do well at this, you will kind of revise these poems in a couple of poems per group, let's say, and you will then go into the exam knowing, right, okay, if I was to get nature as that theme, I'm kind of hoping that I'd get, for instance, exposure maybe, and I'd probably compare it to kamikaze because that's what I've been revising at home. Or if I got a question on war, I might get, war photographer, for instance, and I'd actually compare that then to another poem, from the war section. So maybe Exposure, Charge of the Light Brigade, to say something different about war or the effects of war. So I'll give you that poem. So you need to know what all 15 are about, just in case you get one that comes up that you haven't prepared for. And even if you haven't prepared for it, at least you know what it's about, what happens beginning, middle and end, and at least then you can pick out quotations from that poem. And then I would say revise 2 to 3 in detail from the following subgroups. And I'd probably also put on there, I put Kamikaze as well. Kamikaze, you will see, is a great poem because it talks about war and conflict. You've got the Second World War, you've got the fighting of war and the effects of war, psychological effects on the pilot and this family. You've got man humanity because, of course, you've got this idea that, man, the pilot, is powerless to control his destiny. And then he realizes, no, actually, I'm not going to do this, but that brings great shame upon him. And you've got nature as well, because you've got some beautiful imagery of kind of rural Japan and the sea that forces him back home physically. It's also great for memory because, of course, it's quite a painful memory for him and for the family. It's brought up a sense of shame. For identity, it's this sense of one man against the country. For kind of grief and loss because, of course, although the man doesn't die, he is essentially lost to his family. So I would urge each and every one of you to revise Kamikaze. And if Kamikaze comes up as the name poem, it comes up as the name poem, and you've got a lot that you can say about it there. And obviously this is why we say do 2 to 3 from each of these groups, because you can then compare that to anything else. You'll notice here I've not written it here for some reason, but War Photographer came up in summer 2019. That's not to say it won't make an appearance in summer 2021. Remains on the summer exam in 2020, and of course that was carried over to November, so Remains appeared in November 2020. And again, that's not to say it won't appear in 2021. That's happened with Ozymandias in the past. It's come up in consecutive years, but it might give you an idea of which ones. There is no right or wrong poem to revise. There are lots of you in year 11, of course, revising, trying to work out which one's best to pick. You will have some that you like, some that you don't like, some that you kind of really enjoy, some that you haven't necessarily enjoyed, some that you find difficult, some that you find straightforward. And the idea is just to revise 2 to 3 from each group in detail. And if you know what all 15 of them are about, then you'll be able to pick out quotations, almost treat it like an unseen in the exam, and compare it with the poem you know more about as well in depth there. So what we're going to do, I'd be getting you to make notes on all 15. We are going to cover all 15 poems over a series of videos, but what I would be getting you to do is think about the 2 to 3 from each section that you feel the most comfortable talking about. And that might not be necessarily something that you've spent ages on in class. It might be something that as you're revising, think, oh yeah, do you know what? All of a sudden I get that poem a little bit more. I didn't really understand it at first, but now I understand it a lot more. And there's no such thing as a right or wrong poem, because even if you guess which poem comes up on the exam, you're still going to have to compare it to another poem as well. So this is why we get you to learn a couple from each of those groups there. So have a little look through, and while we're kind of doing these videos, be thinking about, right, which 2 or 3 per group, and what would I say about them as well? What would I say about that theme? Okay, so we'll have a look at Ozymandias in a bit of detail here as well. It can be useful to have a blank copy of the poem. Obviously yours will have notes there as well. It's useful just to see the poem as it will look on the page. Obviously this might be what you get in the exam. And please bear in mind when we go through this, there's no such thing as a right quotation. It's what you want to talk. So there may well be some things here that you think, oh, he's written that down, should I copy that? The reason I include some of these quotations is just to exemplify the standard of analysis we'd expect you to do, or the examiner would expect to see. To be honest, you could say something about pretty much every single one of these words. And of course, try and mention the structure of the poem, but don't make an artificial point about structure. It might be, for instance, that's something you might want to kind of reference there as well. But please bear in mind, there's no right or wrong quotation. So we'll have a little look. First of all, just to recap about what the poem's about. So the poem literally starts with the narrator who meets a traveller who tells him about a statue in the middle of the desert, and find out that the statue has been made by a sculptor, and it's of a cruel and powerful king who's called Ozymandias. who we know, of course, is Ramesses II as well. And this statue has been destroyed, and it now just lies alone in the middle of the desert, completely desolate and destroyed as well. And there's some key themes before we look at our analysis. Key themes here. This idea that nature will always have more power than man. We will die at some point, and nature will come and take our place. And tyrants only have what we call transient power. So if you've got a tyrannical ruler, a cruel, vicious king, then their power won't last, because they one day too will die and nature will take over. And of course also, the poem is written in a sonnet, but it has no regular rhyme scheme, which kind of ties in with this idea of the disrupted narrative voices. We've got many people, it's not just Ozymandias speaking, we've got the narrator, the traveller, the poet, the sculptor is mentioned, and Ozymandias himself, and all these voices, these disjointed narrative voices, all support this idea that actually, Ozymandias' power is completely gone now, and this idea that power is destroyed by the end of the poem as well. And if you're going to talk about the sonnet form, just talk about perhaps quotations from the end of the line. We've got a couple here, for instance. We've got Ozymandias, King of Kings as well, and there is actually another point I'm going to make about this as we're annotating. So let's have a look at some key quotations here as well. First of all, we've gone for, right at the start, it's just the beginning, middle and end really, so you can show an examiner how your tracking change. We've gone for the sneer of cold command. A sneer is quite an arrogant noun here, it's used as a noun, and it shows this arrogance and self-serving contempt for everyday people. A sneer, if you like, is a kind of smile where you raise the corner of your lip and you're almost looking at disgust at somebody, or there's that kind of arrogant sense of, who are they, I know better than them. And this idea of the cold command, the alliteration, the repetition of the harsh C, consonant sounds at the start, this idea of almost this disgust at his subjects, the people that Ozymandias is going to be condemning to death or forcing to work, there's almost this kind of disgust and revulsion of them, really. He thinks he's above them, he holds them in contempt. And this idea, is cold, is he emotionally cold as a leader, or is he just distanced from people who would bring him any sense of kind of joy, happiness, as a ruler there, There are good rulers in the world, there are people who care about their countries and want them to develop, and Ozymandias, from Shelley's creation of him, is an arrogant ruler who is distanced from his people and will issue commands, of course. And it's interesting, commands tying into the commands mentioned in My Last Duchess, this idea of murder. The commands that Ozymandias would be making were to go and kill people, potentially people who betrayed him, people who are causing issues in his kingdom, and also to go and issue his forces to go and give their lives to protect his empire as well. And from the middle of the poem, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. The my name is, we've got the possessive pronoun my, the simple childish arrogance there of him, and this is the inscription on the statue as well. And King of Kings, there's plenty you can get out of here. First of all, if he is the King of Kings, he is saying that he is challenging other monarchs and I am better than you. And it's this arrogance allows the reader to justify ends. Anyone who behaves in such an arrogant manner almost deserves what they get at the end of the poem. And this idea that almost that he's the King of Kings, he's not the king of his people. He's got such an opulent and rich lifestyle that he doesn't really care about himself. He wants to be king of all the other people. He wants to impress those kind of Middle Eastern or Western leaders that would have been around at the time as well. And also it's interesting that in the rhyme scheme, talking about this sonnet form and structure, and this is how you might do it, King of Kings actually rhymes with lifeless things as well. And the lifeless things, and we talk about this rhyme here, the lifeless things that he mentions are the people he governs. But it's also this idea of the statue itself. He himself, he stamps on lifeless things. This idea that he destroyed people, Ozymandias, in his lifetime. He governed people, he was a horrific, cruel ruler. And yet, at the end, he is a lifeless thing himself. And link rhyme, don't just mention the sonnet form, link about aspects of the poem that rhyme as well there. And then finally, by the end, one of my favourite quotations from literature, this idea you can be as arrogant as you like as the poem develops, but the lone and level sands stretch far away. This idea that you'll be completely alone. His empire is completely gone, and all that remains are a couple of legs and a shattered visage. And is used, we wouldn't normally say about and when we're analysing, but it's used repeatedly to qualify descriptions throughout the poem. So not only is he alone, it's levels that, sorry, not only the sands alone, they're level, not as in a lonely place in the desert, they're completely flat, which of course we know isn't accurate in the desert, but it's this idea that nature is a leveler. Nature physically knocks Ozymandias' perch, brings him to the same level as mankind and humanity. Death is the other great leveler. It will come to us all, and in death, no one person has more power than anyone else as well. And the level sands stretch far away. This idea, the sense of nothingness, which is the sum of Ozymandias' power now. Once he has died, he's no longer this force to be feared, and he loses that power. So you've got some lovely quotations to analyse, and we'll have a little look now at historical context as well. There's quite a bit you can say here, and it's never just a case of bolting on context. You need to explain it in a bit of detail. So first of all, you've got the idea of Shelley as a romanticist. Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, is a romanticist as well, but Shelley uses nature to show that actually, rather than human emotion here, if you are being governed by a tyrannical and a cruel ruler, you can one day be free. They will get their comeuppance. And here it's nature that Shelley, the sands, to destroy this statue. And obviously we don't know if it's the sands, it may well have been other people. I get the impression it's more time here that's destroyed this statue, and it has fallen into the sand. And obviously we're all level. So this man who was once above you is now level as you. The French Revolution, this idea of the overthrowing of corrupt rulers to give power back to the people, that kind of ties in with what we're saying there. The fact that the statue lies shattered at the end of the poem, the fact that there is no kind of, no face to this, the fact that the head is lying on the floor, there's just a couple of legs here, completely useless, and it's half sunk into the floor. It's almost gone below, below the kind of the people that Shelley's trying to give power and hope here, suggests that this idea corrupt rulers will get what's coming to them. And this idea that the creations of egotistical man will not endure when compared to those of nature. Think about it. Ozymandias has commissioned a statue of himself, which just shows how egotistical he is. And nature will destroy this one day. It'll come hundreds, thousands of years down the line, but it will come at some point. And just a point, Ozymandias is Ramesses II, Egyptian ruler. The amount of times I read that in an essay and kind of say, so what really? I don't want a history lesson about who he is, and I know who he is, and the examiner will know who he is. What we do want you to do is talk about some of these wider ideas above. So yeah, by all means say who he is, but that should never just be you telling the examiner what you know about him. You should link it in some of these bigger ideas about why Shelley includes him and why Shelley includes the power of nature. And then some links to other poems here. So you've got extract from the Prelude. These ideas here, we've got nature as a powerful force. So an extract from the Prelude, it's the mountain. Here it's the sands and the desert. Exposure, you've got the ice-east winds, the conditions being oppressive, and here you've got the sands. Obviously, interestingly, in Exposure, they're attacking the people, but in Ozymandias, they're attacking a corrupt ruler. Storm on the island as well. You've got the kind of the islanders, perhaps a little bit naive at the start when they say they're prepared, and Ozymandias is naive as well. And Kamikaze, there you've got nature being used to give power to the pilot, give him the autonomy to make the decision to return home, but ultimately that leads in disgrace, whereas nature here leads to the disgrace of Ozymandias. And the power of man as well. London's quite a nice poem to link here. Shelley and Blake are making very similar points there about this idea that rulers have too much power, and although London is thoroughly more depressing in its representation of this power, Ozymandias offers some hope. And My Last Duchess as well, this idea of the cold command in Ozymandias and the I gave commands and all smiles stopped together in My Last Duchess. This idea of two tyrannical rulers who in My Last Duchess, sadly it's the Duke who's left alive at the end, whereas in Ozymandias he gets what's coming to him there as well. So you should have quite a lot of notes there for Ozymandias, and it might be a poem you look at, it might be one of those ones that you kind of want to revise in detail, and if it isn't, at least you've got lots of notes, so if it does come up as the named poem, you've got plenty to say about it there. Okay, so the next poem to consider is William Blake's London, and what we'll do is we'll have a little look through a summary of the poem. Again, it may help to have a copy of the poem with you. You may have your own annotations on this poem. you may have a blank copy, but it's always useful to see the poem and see the kind of thing you get in the exam. Straight away you can see you've got quite a straightforward rhyme scheme and layouts. This is used often by Blake in his songs of Innocence and Experience, and we'll look about that in a minute as well. And you can start by thinking about rhyme scheme and structure as well there, but we'll keep it focused on language, but there might be some useful points to make as you go through. So short summary of the poem. Put simply, it's about a narrator who walks through London, and everywhere he goes he sees poverty and misery there, and the people or institutions in power, governments, monarchy, the military, the church, are doing nothing to help those people. And the key themes of the poem, there's a real sense of anger in this poem through the narrator, through Blake himself, at the corrupt institutions, people and rulers who take power, and actually more of a sense of the impact of corruption on everyday people. You know, we see everything from soldiers, children, poor people, prostitutes, everyone suffers in Blake's London. And this is from, London is from Songs of Experience. Blake did two poems. Songs of Innocence represented this idea of hope and peace in pastoral England. So, you know, the countryside and this idea of, you know, lovely, calm, joyous imagery. And Experience was a more miserable and, you know, exploitative nature, this idea that experience leads mankind to feel a sense of misery, and often that is a sense of urbanisation as well. This is around about the time of the Industrial Revolution as well as the French Revolution. So we'll analyse some quotations. Again, remember, there's no such thing as right quotations to pick out for this. The first one we've gone through is each chartered street, and the chart M's as well. And this idea that chartered represents that, you know, it's an adjective, there's repetition. If you charter something, it means it's something that can be turned into commodity, and that can be bought and sold. Kind of chartered airlines, for instance, where you can kind of lay on an aeroplane flight, people pay for. And this idea is also it's controlled and regulated by a higher power. And so everything in London has been sold. You know, it's kind of the same now, really, but every part and everything has been sold off to institutions. You know, so you'd often have kind of the church would own an area of land, the government may own kind of houses or streets, the monarchy would own houses as well. And so, you know, the common man is excluded from this because it's owned and regulated by a higher power. And even the Thames, has been sold. And, you know, Blake mentions that the river flows. You know, he mentions flow later on. So, you know, that flowing could represent a sense of freedom from this, you know, flowing away from this this idea of control by the state or by the church or by institutions. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, London is a thoroughly kind of miserable, hopeless poem. You've got the mind-forged manacles later on as well. This idea, mind-forged manacles, is a lovely quotation. You can see there's quite a lot of things here. This idea, if something is forged, it is made. Manacles, obviously, are kind of a handcuffs used to control and enslave people as well. And to do that, you would kind of create, you know, melt metal down and chains from that. And obviously, that's a physical sense of control. Chains are physical strong, but here they're used to show control of people's minds. They're mind-forged manacles. So it's this idea that, you know, the state, as well as manacling people, physically imprisoning people at this time, mentally, people are enslaved as well. And this idea people become trapped by their own sense of weakness here, by not challenging what was going on at the time, by just blindly accepting what they were told by government, by the church, by the military, by whoever. And also it's interesting, their mind-forged manacles. You know, if you forge something, you know, Sheffield, where I live, of course, lots of reference to forges. If you forge something, forgeries are actually good. Imitation, you know, come from because you'd be forging lots and lots of manacles, and by the time you've done the 20th or 30th one, it won't be as good as the first, and it's something that can be broken easily. Could also be forged by higher powers. Who's done them? Is it the case that, you know, the state, the government, the church have forged people to believe lies or corruption? Or is it the people themselves who are blinded to the reality of everyday life, and, you know, if they just thought, then they could shatter these illusions as well? It's a lovely quotation to think about, quite dark imagery as well, you know, the simple use of alliteration. And the analysis of the blackening church as well later on. You know, marriage hearse would be a good one for the ending as well to discuss. I wouldn't blame people for picking that one. This idea, church blackening, literally perhaps the appearance of, you know, smoke and the Industrial Revolution, this move away from the pastoral, and London, you know, as a kind of relatively small place becoming a booming urban metropolis. And obviously, you know, if you go down to London, you go kind of through the train now, you'll see the kind of that yellowy brick has gone kind of black in some places from pollution by the Industrial Revolution. But also it's the church that's blackening. And here Blake is moving in the third stanza. This is a good structural point. He's gone from, thinking about the people who are enslaved in every man, in every so-and-so, and every so-and-so, and he's thinking about who does he hold responsible here, and it's the church here. And the church he holds responsible because the church by its very nature should be speaking out against corruption. It should be doing the will of God and protecting people. But because it's blackening, it's tainted by corruption. Or are, I suppose, people tainted themselves? It's this blackening hinting at, the kind of perhaps the souls of people who are sinning and, who are taking money from the poorest people in society through collection plates in churches and keeping money and getting richer on the back of that as well. And Blake, he really attacks the church, he attacks the military, he attacks the monarchy as well here. And he does that because of historical context. You've got the French Revolution. Blake's response to the French Revolution, he was initially a supporter. He wanted the overthrowing of corrupt organisations, and London certainly supports this, saw it as a good thing. But there's a problem with revolution in that the people who overthrow the government often sit with a government that is either corrupt in itself or is, not fit for purpose as well. So Blake's kind of aware that, the hopeless tone of the poem suggests that revolutionaries who replace the government will just have another form of evil there. And it's the corruption and brainwashing by the military, church and state. This idea that we believe things because we're told to believe them. State control. It's quite a subversive poem. This is quite an aggressive and hopeless poem. But this idea, we are told to do things today by political leaders, and we do them because people see them as in our best interests. And Blake is perhaps saying sometimes they aren't, and we need to challenge that as well. And he singles out the military, the church and the state. And by the state we mean Parliament in this country. We also mean the King and Queen as well. And Blake really challenges our blind belief to this, our blind acceptance that we should just do things to further these people. And interestingly, it's not really a poem about nature as such, but there is no natural beauty in this poem because everything, even the church is some beautiful kind of buildings. Obviously, church is the wider body that it represents here, are tainted by corruption. And there's, again, a real hopeless tone in this poem that, nothing is going to change, everything is going to continue the same. It links quite well then with the power of man. Ozymandias and My Last Duchess have got tyrannical rulers. In Ozymandias, of course, the ruler gets what's coming to them. They get justice is kind of served there through nature. In London, of course, it's not served. We get the idea it's going to go on and on and on. In My Last Duchess, similarly, the power of the Duke is kind of all powerful. Obviously, he leaves. And survives at the end of the poem. Emigre is a positive memory of place compared to a negative memory of place in London. Checking Out My History is about a group of repressed people. So, the narrator speaks on behalf of black people who've had their history not represented in a way that Blake speaks on behalf of the poor people of London. And Kamikaze is about kind of similarly a powerless relative who returns home. He's got, you've got the kind of the corruption and brainwashing that you must give your life as a kamikaze pilot for Japan compared to the people with their mind-forged manacles in London, and also that sense of shame and misery as well that his relatives feel on there. So there's a lot to talk about in London. You've got some key quotations. It's a really aggressive and angry poem, and if you can talk about it well and get in some of these wider points of historical context, it's a really, really good and useful poem to talk about. And if you got given it on the exam, it's not come up on the exam yet, so it could well do. You've got some really, really simple language that you can analyse in quite a lot of detail there, so it's quite useful to have these quotations here. Okay, welcome to this final part of the video where we're going to look at the Prelude by William Wordsworth, and it's worthwhile having a look at the sheer size of the poem first, almost as tall as the mountain he's talking about in the poem. When you're calling this poem, call it extract from the Prelude or the Prelude. And of course, it's important to note that the Prelude was an absolutely massive poem that Wordsworth wrote, largely autobiographical about his own life as well. And this hasn't come up on exams before. It's not the easiest poem out there to understand. It's about something fairly self-explanatory, but I think the language, the size tend to put people off this one, but it is quite straightforward once you actually start to look at it, really. And it's quite a good poem to consider when you're considering the power of nature. And also, I suppose, if you flip that on its head, the kind of the lack of power that man has as well. So just a summary of the poem. We really are condensing a poem that goes on over a side of A4 to 3 lines. The narrator finds a boat tied to a tree and takes it onto a lake. He's initially happy, he's enjoying himself, he considers himself to kind of have mastered this, but then he sees a mountain which intimidates him, and this mountain then has a profound psychological impact. And as I've mentioned there, it's part of an epic poem, the Prelude, which is why you've only got an extract from it, which is nearly 8,000 lines, I think it's about 14 books, of Wordsworth's life and nature's impact. Wordsworth was one of the key romantic, with a capital R, poets this country has ever produced. He was a chief exponent of romanticism, and this idea of romanticism as a means of exploring our relationships with society through nature. And it's also man's emotions in response to nature. We get a real sense of the internal conflict. This is how it fits into this group. It doesn't seem to be. It seems quite a strange poem at first. You've just got a giant mountain in there, but it's about that internal conflict that mankind has. And of course, this idea of kind of growing from youth to adulthood as well. We'll have a look at some analysis then. Obviously, it's such a big poem. There's so much you could talk about. And you'll notice I've got quotations from kind of the beginning and the middle, and I've put one in at the end as well. But I'm aware there's quite a few towards the end you could talk about here as well. So as long as you know what happens and you're charting how themes develop as the poem progresses. So first of all, right at the start, we've got the little boat tied to a willow tree. Think in detail here. This little boat is a physical little boat, obviously. It goes out on the boat, but it's also a metaphor for either man's influence or lack of influence on nature, because it's only a little boat, it can't really do an awful lot, or man's journey. This little boat going on its before meeting kind of rocky seas, seeing the mountain, is a metaphor for what the young man, or Wordsworth, feels as he's experiencing this giant mountain. Little hinting, of course, diminutively at the younger narrator, and the adult narrator is kind of retelling the tale. And of course, the boat is tied, it's shackled in some way, which is a man-made action. So man, of course, shackles the boat to a tree, and frees this idea of the fear of nature to come later on. Interesting use of a willow tree as well. A tree is one that has kind of drooping boughs. It can offer shelter to the young man at the start. This idea that the man is almost safe, as the boat is almost safe in the bows. Obviously, as that boat escapes, it's untethered and it's freed onto the river. It's exposed to nature. Willow trees are also often used for kind of grief as well, and grieving. And could that be an example of kind of foreshadowing the grief that the narrator feels later on? And of course, he's enjoying himself on the boat to start. We've got elfin pinnaces, we've got lustily, things like that. But the one I picked out is went heaving through the water like a swan. Heaving, that present participle, showing a real strength, force, power. Our younger narrator thinks that he is in charge of nature. He is stronger than nature at this point. And he's going through the water like a swan. The simile showing the kind of almost two things, really. This idea that, they're moving in perfection. Man and nature are working together. So man and nature are equal here, or they're equal in the minds of the narrator anyway. Or is this of arrogance that he thinks he is graceful as nature? And of course, this arrogance is destroyed later on when he sees the mountain. And the mountain is described as a huge peak, black and huge. It's personified, it upreared its head and dehumanized through the use of it, unlike the boat that's called a she. So you might want to talk about that kind of use of pronoun there as well. But first of all, we've got the kind of repetition of the simple adjectives. Huge, black, huge, mighty forms. Just showing quite simply the power it has over the narrator. The narrator, who has described some beautiful use of language throughout the poem, is almost dumbstruck by the sheer power of this mountain. And he repeats himself with the use of huge. Simple adjectives like black, there's no kind of overly descriptive language here. And it's almost this idea that Wordsworth, one of the greatest poets the country has produced, is dumbstruck by the kind of power of the mountain, or he wants to emphasize the power this has had over him. the sheer overwhelming force of this. And it comes towards the end as well. This idea of huge, the huge is repeated later on, heightening the nightmarish quality that continues to haunt our older narrator. And then mighty forms as well now, they're not mankind, they're things and forms, and they become more powerful than man and the narrator. And any sense of positivity has been removed by this huge and mighty kind of forms. This idea of our narrator as a hero, if you can, stealing the boat bravely and escaping and kind of enjoying himself on the river, has now been kind of punished by these mighty forms who continue to haunt his vision of nature as a good, beautiful force for evil, and the power that he thinks he has over nature has now completely gone. And so when we're looking at wider ideas and context, we're talking about romanticism, the individual's relationship to nature and the power of emotions. And obviously sometimes we think we can control nature. We can chop down massive areas of forests, bulldoze things to build roads, but ultimately nature will be stronger than us. And also the power of our emotions as well. We think we're emotionally in control, and then we see this mountain, this metaphorical mountain, what that is in our lives, and it destroys, it flattens us, it renders us kind of dumbstruck and speechless. Young man who steals the boat discovers that he's not in control of the world. Not necessarily a tyrannical ruler. We're not talking Ozymandias really at the start here, my last Duchess. We're talking just someone who thinks they know better because of their youth. But ultimately, nature doesn't really do anything in the poem. It's there, but it causes the young man to mature after undergoing his internal conflict. So this kind of, we don't see this by the end of the extract we're given, but later on in the poem, obviously, this makes the young man a kind of a stronger person because he can understand the impact of that mountain. And, on a kind of another metaphorical level, I suppose it shows, the challenges that we all face in life are mountains, really, those things that render us speechless and daunting and afraid at some point that we eventually overcome. It's quite a good poem in that you can kind of compare it to a lot of poems with nature in there, because they all tend to say that nature is more powerful than man. Ozymandias destroys the statue. Exposure, it's nature that fights against the soldiers and is stronger. Storm on the island, the storm destroys the island and kind of catches the islanders even though they think they're prepared. Tissue, this idea that we can make all the laws we like in the world, we can use all the paper we want, but ultimately it'll return to dust and decompose. And kamikaze, the natural world has more powerful psychological sway over the kamikaze pilot. And that might be quite a nice link to the Prelude, because you've both got people in crafts who are psychologically affected by something they see that forces them to reconsider their perspective and has a wider impact after the poem. In Kamikaze, it's the life of the soldier's family. And the other thing you might want to discuss is this idea of the man, the power of man. Man is powerless as compared to nature. So any element of man, you might want to talk about Ozymandias in terms of, in Ozymandias, you've got a kind of a cruel ruler. Here you've got someone who thinks they know better and they don't. London, similarly, corrupt power compared to, I suppose, arrogance, my last Duchess. So that might be something you discuss. Some of the mankind poems there might work quite well. But mainly it's used as a poem describing the natural world and the effect that has. But it's really important that you understand it's not just about nature, because nature doesn't do anything. It's just there. It's about our psychological relationship to nature. And it's something we don't tend to appreciate too much in modern society. We tend to go out for a walk if we feel a bit stressed out. We tend to go and look at natural areas of natural beauty. But actually, this was a genuine movement, and this idea that, yes, it's a boat trip and a mountain, but actually that represents something more deeply psychologically rooted within us. So have a look through the poem. Make sure you're making your kind of notes. Please don't feel like you need to copy these quotations. You can use your own, particularly some from further on in the poem as well, if you wish. And in the next video, we're going to go 3 more of the Power and Conflict poems.